Welcome to chapter 16, and this one gets into some of the conflicts over government regulation of big business and the rise of big business. So until this time in the 1880s and into the 1890s, really we had seen companies that were more locally controlled and were not these large national corporations that made millions and millions of dollars. And that changes here with the rise of big business and some changes in the way that companies structured themselves. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the strategies that these businessmen were using, these new strategies to maximize their profits, and then also look at the conflicts between labor, which wasn't enjoying all the big profits that the companies were making. They weren't getting any pay raises. In many cases, they actually were having their wages cut, which causes conflict between the workers and the business owners. And then we're going to see that the federal government will side with the large business owners. And we'll think about why that would be. Okay, so let's start here with chapter 16. And notice our dates here will get us into the early 1900s, as this turn of the century time is a transition. It's a turning point of where we see the government stepping in these conflicts between businesses and labor. So to start with, think about the government wanting to have these big businesses to grow for export of products and to maximize profits for these companies. It's going to stabilize the American economy. But then later on, we're going to see a transition politically to where the government will then step in on the side of the worker. But that will not be until we get to the progressive era of the early 1900s. So all of this is laying the foundation for this power struggle between business and workers. All right, so let's look at the rise of big business. And you can see here that you've got this businessman, and he's really large and he's powerful. And he is being boosted on the profits of the war, things that have come about from the war and their production. He's continued to grow. And one of the examples of this rags to riches story where, immigrants are coming here for opportunity, and an example of someone who's lived that American dream was Andrew Carnegie. His family immigrated to the United States from Scotland when he was a young boy. And he started as like a 10 or a 12-year-old just working in a factory setting, and worked really from nothing to become the owner of one of the largest steel companies in the world ever. And he is one who amassed an incredible fortune and also invested a lot of his money into the community. So we think of Carnegie Hall in New York City. He was a big patron of the arts. Carnegie Mellon University. We've got the Carnegie libraries. He put a lot of money into developing libraries throughout the United States because he believed that education was the key for these new immigrants to come in and to have a better education that would allow them to be more successful. And one of the things that he wrote about, he wrote in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, and I would know about this book. He wrote about his story, his rags to riches story, but he also talked about that, yes, there is a huge gap between the level of economic success of the upper class and the poor, that gap is continuing to get further and further from one another because these ultra rich people are so far removed from the levels of poverty of the average laborer in those factories. He's saying that, yes, that gap is huge, but he emphasizes in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, that everyone in the United States, the standard of living is higher, that because of these big companies, because of the success of these companies, that even the lowest wage earner in the factory is earning more than poor people a generation before would have ever dreamed of. So he's saying that their standard of living, the basic ways of life were enjoyed even by the lowest classes. So think about what that means. Yes, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing, but the poor people are at a higher level than they've ever been before. So he's saying that that's not a terrible thing for society. So he's saying that these companies growing large is actually good for everybody. Certainly him, because again, he's become a very, very wealthy individual. Okay, this idea of how much government should be, how much government involvement there should be in these growing corporations is a constant question that there's no easy answer to. And during this period of growth of the corporations or the rise of big business, we largely see the government encouraging the growth of business, and they do so in a couple of ways. They, as we've already talked about in chapter 15, provide the railroads with land for them to grow very, very large. We've got the passage of the protective tariff, this high tariff to protect the profits of these companies from economic competition from foreign products. And then also the idea of laissez-faire. And I would be very clear on this term. So laissez-faire means like leave it alone or let it be. And this is the idea that the government stays out of regulating business, that it allows capitalism to work, the idea of supply and demand, that companies will expand and grow and workers will have money to spend, and that will in turn encourage other growth of businesses. And then when they outproduce what is being consumed, then they cut back, and it's this constant cycle. But the government should not come in and regulate it, is what this idea of laissez-faire is. Allow the businesses, allow the government to grow on its own. Think about the idea in science, the idea of an ecosystem. What happens in an ecosystem, right, that's perfectly balanced, where you've got predators and you've got prey and you've got all of the food chain and the food web and all of this, it's all perfectly balanced. What happens when you introduce a non-native species to an ecosystem? It just disrupts everything. So that's the idea of laissez-faire. Leave it alone. Don't introduce the government into this capitalist economic system that is regulating itself. Don't bring the government in, because that's like introducing a non-native species into an ecosystem that's going to disrupt everything. So these government policies in the early period are encouraging the growth of of business. So Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that came out earlier than this, he talked about the invisible hand was regulating these businesses, that if you were a company and you were charging too much for a product, then you either have to adjust what you're doing or you're going to go out of business, right? So this invisible hand is controlling the market between quality of products, prices of products, and the way that the businesses are operating. All right, so that's kind of the basic foundations in this early period, is that the government wants free enterprise, free development of business and capitalism, and people to go and start their companies and to be successful. Okay, we also see a change in the way that companies are going to manage themselves. We begin to see specialization within the company. So when we talk about the invisible hand controlling the market, the visible hand is management within the company. We start to see people getting involved in advertising. We see people getting involved in the accounting. We see people specializing in the management of the schedule and the worker, and determining the process, what's the most effective way for conducting the business, analyzing how much to charge for a product. So this specialization in the workforce is what we call the management revolution. So you've got the owners of the company that are certainly at the highest level, but they're not making the day-to-day decisions. They're not specializing in certain areas of expertise. They're hiring other people to do that. So there's an extra layer of management within these companies. And so that really begins to expand as we get into this industrial revolution. All right, so we need to think about how a corporation is formed. And I really like this, this representation of the corporation, and I would probably sketch this out in your notes. because it's complicated. And what we're talking about with a corporation, we've got a company that's being represented by the puppet. So here is our corporation. It's this puppet, and the corporation acts like a person, conducts business like a person, but is not a person. Okay, and the corporation is that way. It has powers to buy and sell property, to conduct business, to sue and be sued, just like a person, right? You can sue a corporation can sue you. The corporation can go and buy property, it can sell property, but it's not a person. Okay, so that's why we're representing this as a puppet. Okay, so it has power that allows it to grow and expand, but it's not an individual. Okay, the puppet master is going to control the actions of the puppet. They make the decisions about how the corporation conducts its business, but the puppet master doesn't own the corporation. All of these people over here who have stock in the corporation own the corporation. So all of these investors have pooled their money together to make this corporation. And so with all that money, they bought land, they built a factory, they've hired workers, they've made decisions about what product to produce and new research and new technology, and they've sold it and they've marketed it. And they get dividends or profits from the success of the corporation. Now, all of these investors, they may not have any sort of knowledge or expertise about the product that's being produced, so they don't make the day-to-day decisions. These people are not going to decide what the new latest feature will be on the new iPhone that comes out. They don't have any knowledge of that, okay? They're just backing it with the money. So these are the owners who entrust this board of directors. It could be a group of people, right? Board of directors is usually a group of people in a large corporation that direct the business. Okay, they're the ones making the decision and the hiring and the firing and what products are going to be sold and all of that. So what we're talking about with a corporation is how it functions in society. So in a capitalist system, the corporation functions as an individual, okay? But it's not an individual, okay? You've got investors and you've got the board of directors, okay? So keep all that in mind. And the goal of the corporation is to maximize its profits, to make as much money as it possibly can. That is the goal of every corporation. So notice here, you've got this cartoon where you've got these two businessmen sitting there, and it says, we could sell the product for $14.95, but we're working to get it up to $49.99. They don't want to cut prices. They want to sell it for as much as people would be willing to pay. And that's what they have to do. They've got to figure out what is that particular point where a product can be sold and sell a lot of it, but not price it too high to where people turn to an alternative. Okay, so the corporations are going to try to maximize their profits. And the job of the business leaders, the managers within the corporation, is to figure out what that point is. How can we make as much money as we possibly can? So some of that is the pricing of the product, but also some of it is the cost of producing that product. And so some of these strategies become very successful during this rise of big business in the late 19th century. So people like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller and some of the others become masters of figuring out how to maximize profits. They use new strategies that have never been used before in these corporations that they grow into giant, giant organizations, okay? One way that they begin to do this is through a monopoly. And in a monopoly, it is when you control all of the businesses in that particular market segment. Now, notice I've got the game of Monopoly here, one of my favorite games. And what happens, all right, so you roll the dice and you move down these spaces and you come over here and you land on St. James Place. But St. James Place is owned by somebody else who's playing the game. And so you pay rent to that person, which is, I don't know, like $28 or something like that. But what happens if you land on this space, this St. James Place, and the person who owns it also owns the other orange properties? What happens in the game when you land on St. James Place? Same thing that when you landed on it before and you paid $28, but this time when you land there, that person owns all three of the orange ones. You pay double the amount, don't you? Well, why would you do that? It's because they own them all, right? So that section of the board, they control. And if they control that side of the board, they have a monopoly on all of the orange properties. And when you have a monopoly, it means that you have eliminated the competition. There isn't any other competition over here for ownership of these properties. You own them all. So if we're thinking about a corporation that produces, what could we produce? A corporation that produces orange juice, for example. If we control all of the market for orange juice and nobody else is selling orange juice but us, then we can do anything we want to the price, because people who are going to buy orange juice, they don't have any other options. So in a monopoly, you eliminate the competition. You're the only one in the market segment, and therefore you can do whatever you want to the price. So a monopoly is really good for the business, but really bad for the consumer. And I would be very clear on that. Monopolies are great for business, bad for consumers. Okay. Another example of a business arrangement is a cartel. And in a cartel, you have businesses that all make the same product, but they make an agreement among them about production and cost or price. So for example, my orange juice example, let's say that I control Minute Maid and somebody else controls High C and somebody else controls Simply Orange, I think is another brand. So if all three of those different companies got together and said, all right, we're only going to produce this many bottles of orange juice, and if you limit your supply, then there's greater demand for it. Therefore, the price is going to go higher for everybody. So if we all agree to the production amount, then we can also all agree to the price that we're going to charge. Because if there's three different orange juice producers and two of them are selling at about the same price, but one of them is selling it for, let's say that we agree to sell, those little bottles that you can get for breakfast or whatever. Let's say that we agree that we're going to sell them for $2 a bottle. Well, what happens if two of us decide to go along with this $2 a bottle, but then the third company comes in and says that they're going to sell it for $1.50? Well, of course, orange juice is orange juice. So everybody's going to buy that $1.50 a bottle. So in a cartel, you've got the same product that's being produced. And I've got the picture there of the oil well, because the best example of a cartel currently today would be OPEC oil, the oil producers economic agreement. And so they determine how many barrels of oil are produced and how much they're going to charge for those barrels of oil, because oil coming out of the ground is the same as another barrel of oil coming out of the ground. So this is great for the producer, but bad for the consumer, because the prices can be whatever the cartel decides that they want it to be. All right, so today, a monopoly is illegal in the United States, right? You can't force other companies out of business, as we'll see through, like predatory pricing, which we'll mention in a minute, or other strategies. You can't force them out of business to create a monopoly. Now, if you're the only person producing an item because no one else is in that market, then that is what it is. But you can't unfairly force businesses out of the market to create a monopoly, because it hurts consumers. So now there's government regulation, but during this early period in the 1880s and 1890s, there was no regulation. And so there were monopolies, and that's how these big businesses started to make massive amounts of money. Okay. One way that they were doing this was through horizontal integration. And I want you to link together in your notes the term monopoly and horizontal integration, because this is really the same thing. Horizontal integration means that you have eliminated your competition in that particular market for whatever the product is. So if we're sticking with the orange juice example, if I own Minute Maid and I force out of business Simply Orange and I force out High C, and I'm the only one left making orange juice, then I have used horizontal integration to maximize my profits because I can sell it now for whatever I want. I can control the price of it. The best example of horizontal integration would be the Standard Oil Company. So I would definitely use this as an example. J.D. Rockefeller used what was known as predatory pricing to force other smaller oil refineries out of business. So by predatory pricing, what we mean is there were other like small little refineries that were serving a local community, and Standard Oil would come in, the big business, and they would undercut the prices of this local oil refinery because they could, right? They're making profits all over the United States where this one local refinery is relying only on their little geographic region. So if Standard Oil comes in and starts cutting their costs for refining oil in half of what this little local refinery does or is able to charge, then the local refinery has two choices. They either have to go out of business, which is what Standard Oil wants, or they can sell their refinery to Standard Oil and become absorbed in it. And then once that happens, then what does Standard Oil do to their prices? They jack them back up again. So predatory pricing is where you adjust your pricing lower than your competition to force your competition out of business. And then after they're gone, then you restore your prices to be at a higher level. So it's a tactic, it's a strategy that's used to eliminate competition, okay? So this is an example of horizontal integration. Integrate meaning you're putting it all together. So if we're thinking about horizontally, these are all of the companies that are in whatever this market is for whatever the product is. And you're trying to eliminate your competition or as much of it as you can so you can raise your prices. And that's an example of maximizing profits for your corporation, okay? Another term for this could also be a trust. Now, for our purposes here, we're going to say that a trust and a monopoly are the same thing. Technically, they're not. Next year, when you take economics, you're going to get into the detailed differences between a trust and a monopoly. But for our purposes, we're going to think about them the same way, where you eliminate competition and you're controlling the pricing. So a trust is where you're controlling the pricing. Now, technically, what's going on is you have the same board of directors. So remember our little example with the puppet. You would have different corporations all producing the same product, but they've got the same board of directors. And so if they have the same board of directors, they can really control the cost for all of them as if it were one company, even though they're different on the shelves in the store. All right, so it's the same thing. It's where you control the market, okay? So a trust is where you have stockholders in different corporations, but one board of directors that are making all of the decisions. But for our purposes, think about a trust and a monopoly as being the same thing. So really, all three of these terms work to eliminate competition: trust, monopoly, and horizontal integration. All three of those are eliminating competition to support the corporation and maximize profit. Who is hurt in all three of those? Who gets hurt by a trust? Who gets hurt by a monopoly? And who gets hurt through horizontal integration? The consumer does. So consumers are hurt by this, but businesses are growing and making tons and tons and tons of money. So J.D. Rockefeller was the master of this, like we said, and he formed a trust or a monopoly with Standard Oil. So it was legal at the time that he did this in the 1880s, but it hurt consumers. So look at, and small business owners, it hurt them as well. So look at what we've got here, the monster monopoly. Standard Oil and all of these tentacles are controlling all of these small little oil companies It actually ends up getting control of railroad businesses and the banks, and it controls everything in the economy. And so this business grows larger and larger and larger, but it's putting a restriction on communities and on consumers because it's jacking up prices for the benefit of Standard Oil Company and J.D. Rockefeller. Okay. Eventually, there will be antitrust legislation, meaning that the government will switch when we get into the early 1900s and begin to make laws that make monopolies illegal. So one of the examples of this is that they forced Standard Oil Company to split apart to create more competition in the market. So this was the original company of J.D. Rockefeller in 1870, Standard Oil. But then after 1911, when there was this antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil, the Supreme Court ordered that they split it up. Okay, so the Sherman Antitrust Act was violated by Standard Oil. Supreme Court comes in and says, yep, you've got to break it up. So all of these companies end up resulting from the original Standard Oil. They become separate companies. And some of those we even see today. Exxon, we know, Chevron, BP, Marathon, all of these are gas stations or gas companies or oil companies that used to all be part of one big monopoly. All right, so this is a cartoon that I want you to pay very, very close attention to. And this one is used a lot in AP US history related to the rise of big business. So this is by Kepler. He was the cartoonist. And notice what's going on here. So let's think about what this area is, right? This is the Senate that's passing laws that allow these companies to grow larger and larger and larger. And guess who's helping all of these senators to get elected? Guess who's contributing to their campaigns? All of these big businesses begin to donate money. So once they donate money to the campaigns, then these people who are in office feel this pressure, this obligation to make sure that the laws favor the businesses growing larger and larger. So here we've got Standard Oil, we have iron and sugar and tin and coal and paper bags and copper and steel and nail, okay? So they're just kind of watching over everything that's being done in the Senate. But I want you to look really closely at what's happening here. Look at the words over here. This is the Senate of the monopolist, by the monopolist, and for the monopolist. Okay, so the monopolists have made this Senate because they've donated the money to get them elected. So now the decisions are being made to benefit them. And look at the entrance for the monopolists. They're coming in, they're getting a seat in the legislature, in the Congress of the United States to oversee what's happening. But over here in the corner, look what it says, the people's entrance. And it's barred shut and it's got a lock on it and it says it's closed. So what is the purpose? What are they trying to get across here with this cartoon? It's trying to show that the government of the United States is catering to the needs of the wealthy and catering to the wishes of the big businesses at the expense of the people. So the consumers are being left out of this. They're the ones hurt by all of these monopolies and trust and all of these big business strategies that are being used. So I would really pay attention to this. I think the title of this is called The Bosses of the Senate, because these bosses of these big corporations were controlling the legislature and the laws that were being passed that were very, very favorable towards the businesses. Okay, so again, those protective tariffs, they're benefiting all of these companies. The legislation that's allowing them this laissez-faire freedom to continue to grow their companies at the expense of consumers. Okay, another strategy that is used by these businesses at the time to make money is called vertical integration. And Rockefeller uses this as well at the same time as he's using horizontal integration. Carnegie also uses this in his steel business. So in vertical integration, you really don't care about whether or not you have competition in the market. Instead, you're trying to figure out how you can save money in the cost of producing your product. And by saving money in the cost of producing your product, you can sell it for the same amount, but you keep more of that as profit for yourself. So let's go back to our orange juice example. So if I am the owner of Minute Maid orange juice, what goes into making orange juice? Well, you've got to have oranges, and you've got to have a factory that takes the oranges and produces the juice and bottles it and then gets it out to the grocery store. Okay. So if I'm buying oranges from an orange grower in Florida for and I'm Minute Maid orange juice, and I have to buy oranges from a grower in Florida, that grower in Florida has to make a profit because they're into farming to make a profit. So they're selling me the oranges at a higher price than it actually costs them to grow the oranges. Okay. Then once I've bought the oranges, then I have to pay to have the oranges transported to my factory. So whether it's a railroad or a trucking company or whatever it is, I've got to pay them to do that. Well, that company, either the railroad or the trucking company, also has to make a profit. So they're charging me more to transport it than it actually costs them. And then the bottling, I've got to have the plastic containers and then the labels and all this other stuff. But what if I bought, because a corporation can buy and sell land and property. So what if Minute Maid orange juice bought its own orange grove in Florida? And what if Minute Maid bought its own fleet of trucks? And what if Minute Maid bought its own bottling facility? What if all of that was owned by Minute Maid? I wouldn't have to pay the extra cost for each one of those steps in production. I can still sell my bottle of orange juice for the same amount of money that I was selling before, but I keep more of it as profit for myself. We call that vertical integration. You don't care about your competition. High C and Simply Orange, they're all still in business, or Tropicana, whatever it may be. I am worrying about cutting my cost to produce one bottle of orange juice. And by doing that, I'm keeping more of the profits for myself, which is, again, one of the goals of a corporation. So these big business owners, they start to employ this strategy as well. We see this even today. Modern corporations use vertical integration. Is there anything illegal about vertical integration? Absolutely not. Nothing illegal about this. You've got all kinds of competition in the marketplace. So if you can, through your business knowledge and ability, figure out ways to maximize your profit within your production, then that's a great thing for you. Okay. All right. So these are some of the big business tycoons of this early time period, and they were contemporaries. They all knew one another. They were very shrewd in their business operations. You've got Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. And here they all are. This is Andrew Carnegie here in the middle. All right, so let's look at the industries that they were in. Andrew Carnegie was in the steel business. Like we said, he's the great example of the rags to riches. He started as just a young boy working in the factories, and then he ended up owning the factory. Cornelius Vanderbilt made his fortune in transportation. He started off in the shipping industry. You may know Vanderbilt University. Their mascot is the Commodore, and they've got the anchors and all that stuff. It's because of the shipping industry that made the fortune for the Vanderbilt family. Well, when railroad technology became more common and widespread, the Vanderbilts saw this as an opportunity. So they expanded their operation, not just to control shipping across the Atlantic between Europe and the United States, but also in the railroad industry. And so they really cornered the market in railroad transportation. So all of these other guys end up using the Vanderbilts transportation, to make their profits and their products. Standard Oil, again, J.D. Rockefeller, and then J.P. Morgan was a banker. So he was part of the banking system with all of this. And then he ends up diversifying and creates U.S. Steel that ends up absorbing Carnegie Steel and becomes this big steel producer. So he's kind of in both. But basically, we think of J.P. Morgan in this early period with banking. You may have heard of Morgan Stanley, Chase Banking today. So that's the Morgan of Morgan Stanley. So the question becomes, were these big business owners, these titans of industry, as we call them, these huge, wealthy billionaires at the time, were they good or were they bad for society? Well, you can argue it both ways. And this really would make a great long essay question where you have to come up with evidence to argue one side or the other, or both sides, but to take a stand of which you think was the most significant. So we call these individuals either, depending on how you're arguing it, they could either be viewed as robber barons, where they take advantage of consumers and they're bad for workers and labor and all of that, and they're greedy and they're bad people. In that sense, we could refer to these big business owners as robber barons. All right, look at the list here, that they exploited their workers. They didn't pass on, huge pay raises to the factory workers. In many cases, they cut their wages. They controlled government. We saw that in the cartoon. They were greedy. They had, control over laws that were being passed. But then on the other hand, you can also argue that they were really good for society. These industrial statesmen or captains of industry would be the positives that they bring to society, such as creating jobs. All of these big corporations have to have lots and lots of workers. And by producing all of these products, they're actually making it more affordable for everybody. And then you've also got the philanthropy or the charity work that they do in their communities, especially Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is the best example of the charity work that he does within the community. So you've got two sides of this very same issue. The rise of big business, is it good or bad? Well, it's good in the sense of all of these characteristics of captains of industry or industrial statesmen, but they're also bad in the very same reasons that we've listed here for calling them robber barons. So you could argue that two ways. So again, I think this would be a great LEQ question, and you would want to give specific examples of these types of situations here. All right, with all of this new production, with all of these new corporations, we also have a new way of buying, and consumer culture becomes national. We're going to have products that can now easily be distributed nationwide with the better transportation that we have. People have more money. Like we said, even the poorest of the poor, their standard of living was higher than it ever was. So we've got department stores, new ways of shopping. So you would have a store that wasn't specialized in selling just one item. You would be able to buy all kinds of things. Think about Walmart and Target. You've got a section for clothing. You've got a section for automotive. You've got a section for office supplies. You've got a section for crafts. You have a section for sporting goods. You've got all different kinds of sections within one store. And that's what Macy's was at the time. So Macy's in New York was this huge corporation or huge department store that people would go and they would shop and they could look at their items and buy them. All right, so here you've got these women and they are shopping for items. And so the idea of advertising and drawing people in to a store that made it very enticing, right? The store windows with all these wonderful items displayed made people want to come in and to buy those. Well, not everybody lives near a big city. So you had the catalog distribution of products. And so the Sears Roebuck catalog was really one of the more popular of the catalog distribution companies. You could buy anything in the world in the Sears catalog. So you had, look, doorknobs, lamps, household products, plumbing fixtures, clothing, all kinds of things would be in the Sears Roebuck catalog that you could buy, and you would order it by mail. So you would, fill out a card. What's the item number that you want? And you would mail it in, and then they would mail you back a box of whatever the item is. So it's sort of like the Amazon of the early 1900s, where you would order by mail what you want, and then it arrives at your door. And if you don't like it, you put it back in the box and you mail it back. So this is changing the way consumers are buying items with department stores and with catalog distribution as well. Advertising for all of this stuff becomes its own entity. People specialized in advertising, coming up with clever slogans and billboards and print advertisements that would go into magazines. Probably one of the more famous of the magazines at the time was the Ladies' Home Journal, because the women were the ones going into these department stores. So they would put ads within the Ladies' Home Journal that would encourage women to go out and buy these products. So we've got magazines, we've got more advertising, and corporations would now begin to have entire departments devoted to advertising for their particular product and how it would be best captured for consumers to want to go and buy that. Okay, one strategy was used here by the Coca-Cola Corporation. So look at this. Coca-Cola, a nice Atlanta company, was initially created by this chemist, John Pemberton, and he ended up selling his recipe for Coca-Cola to Asa Candler. And the massive corporation was then born. But look at this advertisement up here at the top where it says, this card entitles you to 1 glass of free Coca-Cola at the fountain of any dispenser of Coca-Cola. So what they would do, they would go into these stores and they would set up the soda fountain, and you would have the Coca-Cola, which was a syrup that you would mix with carbonated water, and it would make the drink Coca-Cola that we know of today. Well, people never heard of it. They didn't know what it was. Well, if we can get you to try 1 glass for free, guess what? You're probably going to come back and buy it the next time around. So this was a way of getting people to come in and try it for the first time, knowing that they're giving away product for free, but knowing that that's an investment in future sales of Coca-Cola. So this advertising was a strategy. This marketing strategy was very successful, and it became used by other companies. Okay, scientific management, Frederick W. Taylor, I would know his name. Frederick W. Taylor is going to look at this idea of business management as a science. And people began to study business and figure out ways to maximize profits and distributing the work. How long should it take for production of this item from this point to this point? How can we cut corners in cost without sacrificing quality? At what point are we able to have workers not make mistakes, but yet be faster in our production? All of this has to be calculated and determined by business managers. So now when you go and you major in business, when you go to college, that's what you're studying. You are studying what is the most efficient way to produce this product to maximize profits. So what happens then to skilled workers? If we make this automated and we're cutting costs by having fewer laborers and allowing the machine to do the work, what happens to skilled workers? So this is actually hurting those skilled workers. And you've got the businesses that are really concerned about the bottom line, the profit, and not as much about the workers and the conditions in some cases. All right, another area that I want us to focus on is this rise of big business we know is going on in the North, but we've also got a change in the growth of business in the South. And that's going to be what we call the New South. And I would definitely emphasize this in your notes. And the New South is the reconstructed South that is now beginning to industrialize more than ever before. So the idea of reconstruction after the Civil War, if you're going to reconstruct the South physically, you may as well reconstruct it in a more economically profitable way than it was the first time around. So we know that the South had previously been really focused only on large-scale agriculture and very little industry. Well, why not blend the two together? And so that's kind of the idea of Henry W. Grady, who was he was a newspaper publisher here in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper. He was the editor, and he begins to write about what he envisions for the New South. So here is the Grady statue in downtown Atlanta. This is kind of, you can see the, past this big building is the CNN Center and that whole area. And this is down near Georgia State. So Henry W. Grady's speech, The New South, he goes and he travels around and he starts talking about investing in businesses in the South and tries to attract business to come to the area. So anything with Grady's name on it in Atlanta, Grady Hospital, Grady High School, that they're working to change the name now because of questions about his views on racial equality. But Grady High School, Grady Hospital, all of this is named for Henry W. Grady. And it's his influence in making Atlanta this economic success. All right, so part of that, by 1895, Atlanta wants to show off, and other communities around the South want to show off all that they've been able to achieve and hopefully attract more business. And they hold what's called the Cotton States Exhibition in 1895. And it was held here in downtown Atlanta. And so notice this, this image related to the Cotton States Exposition. So we have the New South. All right, so there's Lady Liberty or Columbia, and she's holding this cornucopia of products, cotton and steel and iron and tobacco and sugar. All of this is being produced now in the South, where prior to the Civil War, it would have only been cotton here in this production. So notice that the Civil War, you've got all this destruction, the barn is on fire, the cannon from 1865, you've got ruin here in the South. And then rising out of the ashes of all of that is Columbia and the New South. So one of the symbols for the city of Atlanta is the phoenix, the rising phoenix. And it's this idea of rising out of the ashes of the destruction after Sherman came through Atlanta. So the Cotton States Exposition is going to have corporations and businesses exhibit what they're producing and trying to attract even more investors to build their companies in the South. So here you've got the Atlanta Exposition, you've got the gondola here in the lake, and you've got all these fancy buildings. Well, guess where the Atlanta Exhibition was held? Cotton States Exhibition in 1895. It was in Piedmont Park. So the entire Piedmont Park that we know of today, that has a lake, that has all these running trails and all this park-like atmosphere, it was created specifically for the Cotton States Exhibition in 1895. So the next time you go down to Piedmont Park, think about, this is why it was created. It was created to show off the rebuilding of Atlanta and the South, okay? So here is an image from the Cotton States Exposition. So you've got different countries or parts that have this showcase of all that's being produced here. And here you can see the lake and the little bridge at Piedmont Park. So all of this is part of the big festival that was here, and it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's son. So Frederick Law Olmsted, he was the same guy who designed Central Park in New York City. So if you think about the design of Piedmont Park and then Central Park, if you've ever been in New York City, they're similar, but Piedmont Park is on a much smaller scale, right? So look at these images. So here is Central Park in New York. Okay, you've got a lake, you've got all of this nice vegetation and grass. There's a zoo in Central Park. There's a castle. There is all kinds of things throughout Central Park. And look how much of Manhattan it takes up. It's huge in relation to all of these big buildings. Here's a design of Piedmont Park in Atlanta. So it's a very similar design to Frederick Law Olmsted's Central Park design. And it was designed by his sons, who they were all in business together. So it was, it's clearly, you can see the links between them. All right, at the Cotton States Exposition, Booker T. Washington gives an important speech, and we're going to get further into Booker T. Washington and another African-American leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, in a different chapter in this unit, but I want to mention it here because his Atlanta Compromise speech, his famous speech, was given at the Cotton States Exposition. So there was an effort to try to showcase race relations in the South at the Cotton States Exposition. And Booker T. Washington was probably one of the most prominent figures in the African-American community in 1895 at the time, and he was in charge of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So Tuskegee was a Black college that was in Alabama, and he is coming to Atlanta, and he gives this speech, and look what he has to say. "And all things that are purely social, Blacks and whites can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, and all things essential to mutual progress." What does he mean by mutual progress here? He's talking about economics. So mutual progress, the progress of African Americans, the progress of people in Atlanta, progress of all workers in the South. He's saying that we can socially be separated like the hands, fingers on your hand, but one in terms of all things in mutual progress. So he's saying that segregation, we can be segregated in society, but we can all, white and Black, work together for economic progress. All right, so now this doesn't sit well with everybody in the African-American community, as we will see with W.E.B. Du Bois. But when we compare these two speeches, we will talk about why he's writing this and speaking in this way. But I just want you to be aware that this speech was given at the Cotton States Exposition in 1895. Okay, he also talks about that when he's talking to here, cast down your buckets among those people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields. So he's talking to these business owners who are thinking about relocating businesses to the South and building factories here in the South. And look what he's saying: cast down your buckets among those people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forest, and builded your railroads in your cities. He's talking about labor. So if you're going to build a factory in the South, hire African Americans who have lived among you for all these years, haven't gone on strike, haven't had labor wars with you, have tilled your fields, cleared your forests, build your railroads in your cities. As we have proved our loyalty to you in the past, in nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to their graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by with a devotion that no foreigner can approach. So think about what he's saying here. Who's his audience? Is his audience other African Americans? If it were would he be talking in this same way? That they have proved their loyalty in the past, that we have been humble, and that we have followed when you've buried your mothers and your fathers, and we've had tears in our eyes. Would he be saying this very same thing if his audience were African American? Probably not. His audience would be white entrepreneurs. So he's saying, if you bring your business to the South, you have a built-in labor force that you're familiar with. Don't hire immigrant labor. Cast down your bucket here among the people who you know. Cast down your bucket among African Americans. Hire African Americans. Don't hire immigrant labor, right? So think about what he's saying in his purpose here. His purpose is economic advancement. His audience is white business owners. And so you need to think about why he's crafting his words in the way that he is. So we'll get into this a little bit further when we contrast this with the works of W.E.B. Du Bois in a later chapter. So just hang on to that thought. All right, so speaking of immigrants, there are a lot of immigrants coming into the United States. We saw that in the 1830s and 40s, but there's also now in the late 1800s, new immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and coming from Asia. And the immigrants who are coming into the US are also being targeted as the source of the problems that are beginning to erupt in the urban areas. So if we look at what's happening here, we've got Uncle Sam, and we've got down here, we've got mafia in New Orleans, anarchist in Chicago. And so we've got all of these immigrants who look kind of disheveled, and they've got all their problems that they're carrying with them. And he's pointing out that this is to blame. The immigrants are to blame for those problems. So these new immigrants were coming in from Eastern Europe. So this would be more like Russia, the new areas to the east, more Italian immigrants than ever before, Greek immigrants. So Southeastern Europe, we're going to see more of those immigrants coming in. And this is going to once again cause this rise in nativism. So remind me of the political party that was anti-immigrant back in the 1830s and 1840s. That was the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. So we've got yet again another movement to try to restrict immigration, especially those coming from Eastern Europe and then Asia. Okay, so this is a famous Thomas Nast cartoon. This is one of my favorite ones ever. The American River Ganges. And so notice what's going on here. So look closely at this cartoon. Doesn't it sort of look like mechanical crocodiles that are coming ashore? And you've got this man and he looks like he's trying to protect these children. Well, look really closely at those alligators. Those are really not alligators. Do you notice anything about them? Look at the hat or the mouth. Look at the back here, okay? This is actually a priest, a Catholic priest, okay? Here's his nose and his mouth and his ear, so he's facing down. Here's his hat, right? The hat that the Pope would wear, or a Catholic priest or bishop. We've got a cross on the back of his robe, and he's coming ashore. So one of the big fears here, again, is this idea of Catholics coming into the United States and getting control. And as they begin to have schools and control of schools, what's being taught here? Look at what happens to the public school. It's being destroyed. The flag's upside down, a symbol of distress. They've got these people who are harassing the individuals. And look, there's Lady Liberty, who's at the gallows. And so you've got here this building that looks like the Capitol of the United States, but look, it says Tammany Hall, which we're going to see as one of the political organizations in New York City. But look at the top, there's a cross there. So as you allow Catholics coming in and they're beginning to vote and they're getting control of the government, what's happening to the political institution? Is it being controlled by religious leaders from other places, or is it being controlled by Americans? So this is again showing this idea of nativism. Okay, Ellis Island is going to be opened in the 1890s to try to monitor the immigrants coming into the United States. And when you arrived at Ellis Island, so you've got the ship that's coming in, you had to show that you could be a productive member of society. And you had to show that you weren't sick. And once you cleared through Ellis Island, then you were on your own. So when the ship arrives, the first and the second class passengers were inspected on the ship, right? So do you have money? Can you support yourself? Are you going to be a burden on society? No. Are you healthy? Yes, you're fine. And so you're free to go on your way. You never really actually went to Ellis Island. So if you go to New York City, here's Ellis Island. It's right by the Statue of Liberty out in the harbor. So third class passengers were the ones who actually went to Ellis Island and went through this process of inspection. And it usually took maybe 5-6 hours to go through this process, maybe a day, and then the vast majority of immigrants were sent on their way. Okay, so these third class passengers, these would be the poor. So the way I like to explain it, if you've ever seen the old movie, The Titanic, and Leonardo DiCaprio's character is kind of, he's on board the ship, but they're just really crowded in there in the bottom of the ship. They don't actually have their own rooms, and it's just really hot and crowded in there. That would be steerage. And so all of those people would go through Ellis Island to be processed. And Kate Winslet's character, the girl who he falls in love with, she has a lot of money. And so they would have been in first and second class. And so they wouldn't have actually gone through Ellis Island. All right, so here is the process. Notice they've got their belongings with them and they're being looked at. Are you healthy? Yeah, you look okay. And then here you just declare who or what kind of skills you have and how you can be a productive member of society. Angel Island is not as well known, but it's kind of the same purpose of screening immigrants who are coming into the United States, but it's screening them on the West Coast. So Angel Island is in San Francisco, and it opens in 1910, and it's in response to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So where we talked about the Burlingame Treaty in chapter 15, that was opening up this arrangement between China and the United States with immigrant labor coming in with the railroad and protecting the immigrant labor, that all goes away by the 1880s because there's a lot of pressure with all the Chinese immigrants that are coming in. They're viewed as having taken American jobs, and so they begin to try to restrict Chinese immigration coming into the United States. And so Angel Island is a very, very different experience for immigrants coming in than those who are coming through Ellis Island. Okay, so this is really a way to force Chinese immigrants back to China and not allow them in. So the process here can take months, and it's very difficult to actually gain access to the United States. And here's why. You're going to be interrogated, and you have to prove that you already have a family member living in the United States to gain access. So if you had come into the United States during that time of the Transcontinental Railroad construction and you had relatives who were already here, you had to prove that they were already here, and that's why you're coming to live with them, to reunite the family. And that's going to be really difficult to prove. Okay, so the Chinese Exclusion Act, I would emphasize this, that this is a way of discriminating immigrants from a particular country. They were not allowed in the United States. All right, so here is someone who is at Angel Island waiting to be brought in and questioned. So when I traveled with my friends, we went to San Francisco, and this is taken from Angel Island. So if you've ever been to San Francisco, and you've taken the ferry boat out to Alcatraz, which is the prison that's out in San Francisco Bay, the very same ferry boat that you took from the docks, you could have taken one that goes to Angel Island. So if you go back to San Francisco next time, I'd go and visit both, because Angel Island is really an interesting place to go and visit. So it's right outside of San Francisco Bay. So here's Angel Island, and then probably over in here is Alcatraz, and it's looking back on downtown San Francisco. All right, so this is from the inside. Got a lot of fences, and you are restricted if you are coming in here, and you're going to be there for a while, for months, not hours like it would have been in Ellis Island. And when you are questioned, you have to, they're going to ask you, who is here in the United States that you know. And you're going to give them their name and their address, and they're going to contact that person, and that person's going to have to come to Angel Island, and they're going to be questioned. You're going to be in one room, and the person who is supposedly your relative is going to be in the other room. And they're going to ask you a series of questions to prove that you are related to them, and make sure, so you don't know what they've said and they don't know what you've said, and the questions are going to be asked, and the answers have to match in order to prove that you are related. Look at these questions. All right, which direction did your doorway face back in, in China or wherever you lived? How many windows were in your house in China? What side of the room did you sleep on? How many steps are there to your front door? Well, front door from where, right? What material is on the floor in your bedroom? How many times a year did you receive letters from your father? How did your father send you money to travel? Who lived in the third house down the street? I don't know that I can answer these questions, even right now. So much less if I've been in the United States for a couple of years working on the Transcontinental Railroad, how would you be able to answer these? That's the whole point. The answers aren't going to match. And because they don't match, you're going to be sent back to China. Okay. One of the ways that people began to get around this was through a system called the paper sons. And this is a fascinating arrangement where people, Chinese people in the United States who were already here, began to start to sell their family to people in China who wanted to come here, and they became known as paper sons. So what they would do is they would send to China like a little notebook that was filled with information for you in China to memorize as this person's relative. So any possible thing that you can think of, these stories were made up. You would memorize that story. And when you came to Angel Island, you would give them the name of this person who you've made this arrangement with and has sent you this notebook, and they would bring that person to Angel Island and they would ask you questions, and you would hope that it would match up, and it was possibly a way for you to get in. And so these were known as paper sons because it was only on paper. You really weren't related to the person. So I wish that we were in class, but Officer Kwan, our campus police officer, this is actually how his family came to the United States, was through the paper sons. And I have him come to class every year and tell his family's story, and it's fascinating. So he's proud to tell his story. I think that previous generations, they would have been a little more reluctant to tell the story of being a paper son, but his last name Kwan was actually the name that his family purchased by the paper son process. So, you know, if it worked and the person got into the United States, then you would pay them an amount of money for, you know, selling that story and for going through this process. And so Kwan is the last name of his paper son last name, but his middle name is Liu. And Liu was their real Chinese last name. And so his family has always named their children, the middle name is Liu, because that is their real Chinese last name, and Kwan is their paper son name. So it's really an interesting story. And I hope he will be able to tell us that story this year as well. But so it was the Chinese Exclusion Act that forced his family to go this route of paying for a paper son connection here in the United States. All right, so these would have been the bunks and the barracks where people would have been staying for an indefinite period of time. And what the National Park Service has determined is that under all of this paint on these walls is graffiti that's been etched into the walls. And it's they say it's poetry and it's stories, it's identifying different people who were there over time. And so we've got these Chinese symbols that have been uncovered by chipping back the different layers of paint on these walls at Angel Island. So here are some more images from Angel Island. This would have been the dock where the boats would have arrived. And here's one of the interrogations. So again, you've got this man being asked questions by a group of people to see if his answers match those of whoever his relative is who's already here. Look at this medical interrogation or exam, much more thorough than what we saw from the images of Ellis Island. So it was not in any way the same level of scrutiny that Western Europeans went through as they immigrated into Ellis Island. So this just speaks to the racial discrimination against Asian immigrants coming into the United States. And a lot of that had to do with fear of job competition, work in the West, and not wanting more immigrants to come in. So again, this is the cartoon, Where's the Blame? So we see that the socialist in New York, the anarchist in Chicago, the mafia in New Orleans, who's to blame? Well, all of these immigrants are, according to this guy who is talking to Uncle Sam. You got to shut off that immigration, not allow more people to come in with their problems. All right, the last thing that we want to look at here in chapter 16 is conflict that arises between labor workers and also with the business owners, because they get exploited where these huge fortunes are being made. they're not seeing pay raises. And that causes a lot of resentment and conflict between the two sides. The conditions that people were working in were just terrible. You've got the tenement houses where the immigrants are just packed in. You've even got women who are working within their homes as seamstresses, and these terrible, terrible conditions, in addition to the factory conditions that are continuing to decline. Company towns also began to develop. We talked about the Lowell system, and the Lowell system is like a company town where the company controls everything within the community. So they control the housing, they control the general store, the loans that are being made, all of this is being controlled by the company. And again, it all benefits the business, but it exploits the workers. And so there's conflict that begins to develop. Even in the rural areas in the West, we're going to see that farmers are being taken advantage of by railroads and by grain elevator companies that come in and begin to charge ridiculously high prices. And the farmers in the rural areas begin to actually form groups to negotiate as a group rather than as an individual. And so that's going to be the key here. When we start to look at these labor unions, it's about collective bargaining, the power of numbers versus one person negotiating. So in these rural areas, one of the organizations was called the Grange, and the Grange would represent the farmers in a community, and they would negotiate with the railroads in their communities. So like each state and each community had their own chapter of the Grange, and they would work to lobby politicians to make laws and to make sure that their rights and their fees were fair and that they were being protected. This spills over into the Greenback Labor Party. So they're also wanting more money in circulation, which we'll get into later on about the idea of free silver and the gold standard. So they want more money in circulation because that's going to help them to pay their debts and what they owe. So this begins to merge this idea of labor using labor organizations spills over into politics at the same time. All right, so collective bargaining, like I said, strengthen numbers. If I'm a factory owner and one person comes in and they complain to me that their wages are too low, I'm going to say, see you later, because there are probably 50 immigrants outside wanting that person's job. So collective bargaining is where there's a little bit more power behind it. So the workers as a group will come in and protest. They are demanding changes, wages being raised or hours being reduced or safety in the workplace, conditions, whatever it may be. They make those demands as a group. And if nothing's done, then they're going to go on strike as a group. And when my factory is not in operation, I'm losing money. Every minute that factory is not working, it costs me money. So I would be better off negotiating with the entire group quickly to get my factory back running than to stay out of operation while the strike is going on. Okay, so this idea of collective bargaining, there's strength in numbers for workers to work together. So that's going to be the idea behind these early labor protests. Okay, some people began to equate what these workers were wanting with socialism, where they were wanting to make sure that the profits were shared equally with everybody. Why should the business owner make all the money when the workers weren't getting any pay raises? So instead, they were wanting it to be distributed. And so people are to at least have higher wages, and people were calling this socialism, which they became very afraid of in the early parts of the 1900s, especially when the Communist Manifesto comes out by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which is this statement about how workers of the world will never stand for their labor to go to make someone else rich. And so in this Communist Manifesto, they are predicting that the workers of the world are going to go on strike, that they're going to quit working for the benefit of someone else. And so they're promoting this idea of communism, and it scares business owners. And so they become really unnerved by some of these labor conflicts that arise in the United States, because you kind of have to make sure that you remember the context around which all of this was happening. And it's this growing movement, this communist movement and socialist movement that is moving from Europe. We're beginning to see these radical ideas coming into the United States, and it scares people. Okay, one of the early labor unions was the Knights of Labor. This was one of the largest of the early organizations. It started out as a secret organization, but then it became open and it was very inclusive. You had women who were members, you had African Americans who were members, and the Knights of Labor. They didn't have a ton of success in their strikes, but it was an effort for working together, collective bargaining, as we've talked about. Okay, so Terence Powderly was the founder of the Knights of Labor, and they were a very, very, very large organization. But then labor unions and their strikes began to be equated with anarchists. All right, and one of the incidents that occurred was a riot in Chicago in 1886. So these workers were on strike. They were protesting because their wages had been cut and there was unsafe conditions in the factory. And so they had planned this Saturday afternoon, they were going to have this protest in downtown Chicago. While these anarchists join in with the labor protesters at the same time that they're in the streets of Chicago, and the police show up, and a ruckus arises, and a bomb is thrown in the middle of this riot or this protest in Chicago. And as a result, you've got policemen who have been killed. The policemen began to fire on the crowds of the protesters, and you have loss of life. So when this is reported in the newspapers, it begins to seem as though the labor unions are the radical, dangerous organization that's now killed policemen. So people start to shy away. The membership in the Knights of Labor begins to decline a little bit as they get bad press from some of these riots that break out. So the Haymarket riot is one of the first ones and one of the deadliest of the riots that result between labor disputes and business owners, and it was in Chicago. So when my friends and I traveled to Chicago, we went and found the point where the Haymarket riot occurred, and all that's there now is this statue in the middle of the street. So you've got the two-way traffic, and this is a statue that's kind of in the median in between the traffic going one direction and going in the other direction on the other side. So we decided we were going to recreate the Haymarket riot there, complete with costumes. And so here you can see we've got some of the rioters here, and then we've got the policemen. So you can imagine what people thought as they were driving by as we were recreating the Haymarket scene. All right, farmers also began to use collective bargaining as well, as we've talked about, sort of like with the Grange. The farmers' alliances are doing the same thing. This begins in Texas, and then other states begin to form these alliances as well to negotiate as a group for better prices. If we've got to transport our cattle from the cattle drive in Texas to the slaughterhouses in Chicago, then let's negotiate it as one big group of people, because we're going to get a better price that way. The Interstate Commerce Commission is formed. And so at this point, it says that states cannot regulate commerce that goes beyond their boundaries. So when you've got a train, for example, that crosses from one state to another, the states can't regulate that. That's going to be up to the federal government. So you would think that this is a good thing for consumers, that it's going to regulate businesses, but it really isn't enforced a whole lot. Okay, so it's kind of it's still the federal government, this question about how involved the federal government should be in regulating big business. Interstate Commerce Commission is founded in the 1880s, but it's not really going to be given any power to enforce anything until about 20 years later. Okay, so this court case, Wabash versus Illinois, it's the Wabash and Pacific Railroad that is suing the state of Illinois because they didn't want the state to be regulating them. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is a government agency to regulate big business. Not really enforced in this early period, but it will be later on, okay? The larger of the, or the last of the big labor unions that I want you to remember. So we've got the Knights of Labor, very inclusive, very large organization, but not terribly effective. The American Federation of Labor is going to be different. They actually still exist today, the AFL, and they're founded by this guy, Samuel Gompers, and they're going to be much more successful in their efforts to force business owners to comply with labor demands. And they do this in a couple of ways. One is that they charge dues. If you're going to join the AFL, you have to pay dues, just like if you join a club at Lassiter, you pay dues. Well, at Lassiter, when you join a club and you pay dues, that probably gets you a t-shirt, it probably gets you a Chick-fil-A biscuit at some point, and it probably gets you, they put together, I don't know, like a scholarship or something that they give to a graduating senior. When you join the AFL and you pay your dues, all of that money goes into one giant pot. And if you think about a labor union that goes on strike, these are poor factory workers who are going on strike. And if they're on strike, they're not working. Are they getting a paycheck? They're not. So how long can they really stay on strike? If you've got the wife and the kids at home, you're not going to be able to stay on strike very long because you don't have an income. So these business owners began to recognize that, and they felt like if they could wait it out a week or so, the strike would be over because the workers can't stay on strike forever. Well, what the AFL does is they put all of this money from across the country, all these members of the AFL, they put the money into one giant pot. And if your factory goes on strike and you're a member of the AFL, you're going to get a little bit of that money to help feed your family and pay your rent. You're not going to make your full wage, but you're going to get just enough to get by so that the strike can last longer. Well, if the business owners know that the workers who are on strike are members of the AFL, they know that that strike could go on longer. So it's going to be better if they go ahead and settle and negotiate whatever the issues were in the first place. So the AFL has some more success. They're not as inclusive as the Knights of Labor were. Women were not allowed to be part of the AFL, neither were African Americans. And it was more skilled labor. So it's a smaller group of people, but it's going to be more effective. And it's going to cost you some money to be part of this labor union as well. Okay, a couple of the strikes are going to become very deadly. We've already talked about the Haymarket riot. There's one at Andrew Carnegie's steel mill in Pennsylvania. He had cut wages and the workers were furious. They go on strike. And the plant manager at the time was this guy named Henry Frick. And Henry Frick calls in the Pinkertons to try to maintain control and order at the factory during the strike. The Pinkertons were like it's not really a police force. It's Pinkertons officers are like private security guards that you can hire. And he brought those in to the plant to maintain order, and it erupts into this huge, violent, chaotic mess. And so then the Pennsylvania militia comes in to put down the strike. So once again, you've got these labor strikes that are creating this very violent image in the minds of Americans. So people, again, start to kind of shy away from joining these labor unions in some ways. The Pullman strike is another one that happens that draws a lot of attention. Pullman is a factory town, a company town that's right outside of Chicago, and they build Pullman Palace cars. And these are the luxury passenger train cars. If you've ever seen an old Western movie where they have the beautiful mahogany paneling inside and the velvet seats and the beautiful Tiffany lamps that are lining in the train car. Those are Pullman cars. They're very, very fancy. And working at Pullman was really a great thing because the company town had these beautiful brick brownstones that the workers lived in. The wages were pretty good, and it was a very park-like atmosphere. It was out of the urban area of Chicago, so it was cleaner. You didn't have all of the problems that you would have if you were crammed into an urban area like we've talked about with the tenements. So things were going really well for people who were Pullman workers, but then their wages were just dramatically cut in the 1890s. And the workers were like, no, we're not standing for this. So they go on strike. Well, they're part of the American Railway Union. And this Pullman strike expands to all of the railroad workers in the United States. All right, so this is the Pullman strike. Here's the company town. We went to Pullman when we went to Chicago, not much there. They're trying to revitalize the area. It's an abandoned factory. It's not in operation anymore, and the town is abandoned, but they're trying to bring back the brick brownstones into affordable housing for people, and they're kind of nice. So this is a Pullman Palace car. This is what they were producing in the factory, and the workers had gone on strike. But look at this beautiful town, right? So there truly is strolling that's going on here. You've got the factory in the background. You've got this community center where they would have lectures and they would have dances and they would have concerts and all these things in this beautiful building. It was almost like a in your neighborhood when you've got the clubhouse. I mean, this is the clubhouse for the workers at Pullman. So if you could get a job at Pullman, I mean, it was that was the best thing that could ever happen to you. Look at this housing. So in the 1890s, this would have been very, very luxurious. Think about those immigrants who are moving into Chicago and these factory workers. You would have never been able to afford anything like this anywhere else. So when their wages were cut, the factory assumed, things are great here in Pullman. They're going to accept this, but they didn't. So they go on strike. And the Pullman strike, because they're railroad workers, there was this big union called the American Railway Union. And I would write that down, the American Railway Union. And every railroad worker in America belonged to that same union. So it was the ticket takers, the conductors of the railroad, the people who built the railroad tracks, and the Pullman workers, the people who built the railroad cars. Anyone connected to the railroad industry belonged to this union. So when the Pullman workers went on strike, the American Railway Union went on strike as well. And that meant that the entire transportation system in the United States shut down. And Eugene Debs, I would know his name, Eugene Debs was in charge of the American Railway Union that supported the Pullman strike and the entire system being shut down. Well, when they get shut down, the government goes after Eugene Debs and tries to force him to stop the strike. He refuses. And so they arrest him for interfering with mail delivery, which, by the way, is a federal offense. So don't bash a mailbox. Anything tampering with the US mail is a federal offense. So by stopping mail delivery, they arrested Eugene Debs and they put him in jail. And while he was there, he is going to read the Communist Manifesto and he's going to really buy into this idea of socialism. And he will found the American Socialist Party in the United States. And they will begin to run candidates in elections as socialist candidates. So his idea with the labor unions, he starts with the railway union as a labor leader, and then it merges into a political career for the Socialist Party. He ends up running for president later on. So you can see here, that they're mocking him running for president, that he was in jail also as part of this. So the American Railway Union and the Pullman strike, again, is yet another example of the impact that these labor leaders will have on society. So big business, rise of big business in the 1880s and 1890s, a lot of money to be made with new business strategies that become mainstream and commonplace and are still used today. But then also the conflicts that begin to emerge between labor and businesses. So at this point, in every one of these conflicts where we saw the railway union and the arrest of Eugene Debs, and we saw the militia being brought in Pennsylvania to stop the Homestead strike, and every one of these situations, the government sides with business. They're not coming in and protecting the workers and siding with labor. They are siding with business. So I want you to notice that here in this early period, rise of big business, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Government sides with business in legislation, in protection of, a laissez-faire economy, a protective tariff, and also with labor strikes. They side with the businesses, not with the workers. That will change when we get into a later chapter in the progressive era. It flip-flops, and the government then begins to side with the workers and consumers and then restrict big business. But for now, it's going to be the opposite. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.